Welcome back to another episode of the Changelog, number 4. Actually, it is this time around. As always,
Ready?
I'm joined by Daniel,
It's me.
and today we're gonna bring you up to speed with all the things that transpired since the last recording. Daniel, do you want to
That's
take
right.
things off with industry
Yeah,
news?
we are back at it, and it has been a busy few weeks in the signage industry. Many of you who are involved know Digital Signage Summit Europe was just a couple weeks ago.
Last week.
Just last week. Sorry, in Munich, and we're definitely some heavyweights there in the signage industry. Lots going on there. Recognize some important people and friends. They had a strategy award session, just recognizing some of the long-term contributors to signage. As more of a industry-wide, big moves. So, I don't know if you had anything to add there, Victor. On
Yeah, I mean, there were a few things to note there. Like one thing that I've been speaking a bit about with Invidis, which is the analyst firm that organized it, is kind of like a push more towards appreciating security in the signage world. So I was actually invited to be in one of the panels about security at DSS Europe, but I unfortunately I couldn't make it. But that's I think something that
airport hotels.
Yeah, no, it's but it's good that we're having the discussions, right? So I've had a discussion with these people for a while about security, and it's glad to see that they are actually recognizing that in these events, and so that's something that I very much welcome. And they also shipped what's called the digital signage software compass, which is something that we got well, I at least got a preview of at ISE early this year, and it's basically a piece of software that they've designed as being as a kind of a fact check, vendor agnostic selection tool. It's basically a buyer tool, and we were in there from launch, and it was announced last week then, and that tool is supposed to be like a platform tool for buyers that can select their criteria, and get objective data on actually what's the vendors are out there, because like it's a bit of there are so many vendors in this industry, and it's hard sometimes for outsiders and buyers to understand what the USPs are for the various vendors, and that's what they're trying to solve for in this project. So that's something that was announced there. I don't have a ton more information about the actual event because I wasn't
there. Yeah, but it's always I mean, we were at ISE, in January. Signage is a industry with a big impact, but a small group of key players. So
yes,
hi to everyone who went, and I'm sure it was a good time. So and likewise, other big events. InfoComm is coming up.
I think it's
good
next
old
week
Vegas,
in Vegas
session.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. So love it or hate it, it is what it is.
Weather's supposed to be boiling over there apparently, and I'm sure there will be a big overlap between people who were in Munich last week and people who are in Vegas next week.
Right, crossing the pond. So cool. So I think that's covers kind of the big events. Wanted to cover another story that was recently in 16.9 from your part of the world, Victor, in Scandinavia. It was a quick feature on the Juraskog, probably killing the pronunciation there.
Juraskog.
Okay, there you go. My Swedish ancestors are rolling over now. So anyways, it's a burger chain in Sweden, and they have some airport restaurants, and they recently implemented a digital signage solution to notify passengers how long it would take to get their food, and then the customer can make a judgment on whether or not they want to do that and go to the gate. So really cool implementation of signage that has real-time interaction with a business's data and can then provide useful information. So It didn't really give a ton of information on how they actually executed that. There's a few obvious and maybe not so obvious ideas as to how they did it or methods that they could have implemented. But yeah, as we experiment more with our own Edge apps push, these are like the exact type of examples where you can have digital signs not just display information that was written by a design team weeks ago. It can be real-time changing information that interacts with the a live environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, I like these use cases because they add real utility, right? And we I actually had a call this week with SAP about doing integration work with them and building integration with ERP. I think in signage is really interesting because that's where any sizable business, that's where their real data lives, right? It's in their ERP system for most of the data. And historically, we also work with a partner for NetSuite integrations to have like real-time dashboards for NetSuite. So something we have seen we haven't seen it in the retail sector, but for like manufacturing and for more industry-oriented sectors, we've seen that before. And I think it's something that is a good use case for signage. It's adds utility, and I think that's the best way to think of it. It's really useful data, and it's not signage for the sake of signage showing sleek imagery, right?
Yeah, and talking about showing data dashboards, regardless of the system, whether they come from an ERP like NetSuite or not, for anyone who is joining us, perhaps as just a consumer, one of the biggest problems is one of the simplest ones, but if you can't get around it, you can't get around it, which is how do you display company data on a sign that is password protected? You have to get your signage hardware to get the credentials that think it can then show that data. Sounds easy, but actually implementing it is quite hard, and it's something
it's very complicated, right? Because there's in particular, if you're talking about enterprise settings where there are more sophisticated authentication methods, that's when it gets really complicated. And that's when we announced our Power BI dashboard, for instance. It took a lot of work and a lot of engineering work to get that done right. Because like you can't, like, as soon as you deal with credentials, you need to take things seriously. Right. You can't just like throw credentials around, because if they leak, that has vast consequences for these enterprises. So yeah, like this is something that we are doing a big push for internally to build out with the help of Edge apps and helper functions that we're building behind the scenes for authentication. Something that we are getting easier with Edge apps because of all these functionalities we built out. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Displaying dashboards and data sets that are behind dashboards, behind credentials, they are, generally speaking, somewhat challenging to display.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that covers our industry update section. Summertime in digital signage. So here we are.
Indeed.
Definitely, let's cover some product updates here at ScreenLink. Again, if you want us to be quiet about Edge apps, we will not be. So here we are. Recently just about live for everyone to use, but we've been working very hard on a Edge app for bus stop arrival and departure times. Very interesting work. Victor, maybe you have something to say there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good starting point. I mean, so again, this is kind of a push towards building out use cases for Edge apps. And the very first one we built out for transportation has been a bus stop Edge app for TfL bus data. And TfL stands for Transportation for London. So it's the big kind of management company behind all things public transports in London. And it's very much something designed to be running inside an office, and you kind of want to monitor, say, the departures from the bus stop outside your office or similar. So the way it works is essentially plug in the stop ID into the Edge app, and it will automatically display in real time what the next bus that will show up for that given stop is. And it's somewhat complicated because turns out there are a lot of bus stops in London. So finding the bus stop ID is somewhat of a challenge. And so we essentially built out this little helper tool here that allows you to search for the bus stop that you want to go for. But as you can see here, some of the bus stops have multiple stops, or some of the locations have multiple stops, like the major ones, but whereas other ones do not. So you basically need to provide the Edge app with one of these stop codes, and then you will get something that looks like this, and that would automatically pull data, pull it down, and if you have multiple of these, you can just circle through them in your deployments. And this is open source. It's on GitHub. It's in our playground, including that bus stop lookup tool. It's also open source and on GitHub.
So and, on that point, Victor, so we have this Edge app for the bus stops in London. One question: so for developers who want to adopt this Edge app for some transportation in their own hometown, talk a bit about that. Is that possible? What would be the next steps?
Absolutely. Yeah, so this is our long-term goal, right? So we basically want to use this as a kind of framework or plumbing for future Edge apps for other cities. So we will build this out and add support for, SMTA, which is San Francisco Metropolitan Transportation Agency, or similar for New York or wherever you want. And the idea is we build the plumbing, so all that you really need to do is provide with an API. And then all the UI UX elements are reusable. So the idea is that they should be very easily pluggable. So you can just plug that into whatever framework API that you want to use. So as long as you can get the transportation data for a given bus stop over an API, the idea is that we can plug this in. And we started with bus stops, but we will expand this to subway. So we will probably do next up the London tube status, for instance, and other similar ones. But yeah, it's the first step towards like pushing the boundaries of Edge apps, and we're building up more and more of these. And it should be live in the App Store in the coming days. So probably by the time this is live, it will most likely be in the App Store and ready to install for anybody who wants to just deploy it. And if you want to inspect the source code, it's on GitHub, like I said, in our Playground repo, as always. And just modify it to the way any way you see fit.
Yeah, awesome. All right, cool. Well, that's exciting. I also want us to talk about there's a big update with Screenly Antheus.
Yes.
Let's start with question number one. Victor, what is Screenly Antheus, and why should people care about it?
So Antheus is our, origin story. This is where we all started. So it's an open source digital signage solution, which is the most popular digital signage project on GitHub. So it used to be known as Screenly OSC, but I believe last year we renamed it to Antheus because it created a lot of confusion for a lot of our users about the naming, because Screenly and Screenly OSC were way too similar in naming. We've been supporting and building Antheus since 2012. This is where we started. And Screenly, today's Screenly is essentially a fork, or used to be a fork of Antheus, but has since completely diverged. And we've still been committed to Antheus, and we've been paying developers ever since to maintain and develop Antheus. And we are now doing a big overhaul of Antheus. And we are basically future-proofing it a bit. So it used to be written in Flask, I believe it was, or maybe it was Bottle, which is one of the Python frameworks. And now we're moving it to Django to essentially leverage more of a structure to make it both easier to maintain for ourselves, but also easier for contributors to help push features and develop Antheus going forward, because it becomes more of a standardized way of doing things rather than a lot of custom code that we've written ourselves. So just lowering the bar essentially for contributing and also using
Yeah, yeah, it's super important to develop that contributor community for a project like this, because Antheus is commercially supported out of essentially our own charity fund. So
Yeah, essentially. I mean, that's
yeah,
we are paying for the developers to maintain it from the
right.
revenue from Screenly, right? So we are still very committed to maintaining Screenly, both Antheus and Screenly, because I think they both
Yeah,
play a very important role. And there is
for sure.
a big use case for Antheus, right? Because there are a lot of use cases where you don't necessarily want an enterprise
Yeah,
grade or secure signage provider, right? You just want to have something that runs on a Raspberry Pi.
Right. So on that, another question for people who are maybe just learning about Antheus and Screenly, Screenly's commercial version. What are the differences that the user will find between Screenly Antheus, our open source version, and Screenly's commercial offering?
Yeah, very good question. Antheus is designed for being a standalone signage player, essentially, that runs by itself on a single device. So you deploy it on a Raspberry Pi, and it runs completely self-sufficient on that device. What we are building out going forward is to add support for other platforms. So we don't have to decide on which platforms these will be, but the idea is that it will be a signage solution that caters for basic signage need. Like if you imagine you have a restaurant, you have one screen, it's perfect for that. It's not like Screenly is kind of overkill for if you have like one or two screens, honestly. Where Screenly shines larger deployments, right? If you have hundreds or thousands of screens and spread across a large number of locations, then Screenly shines, right? We take care of all security updates and software updates. All those things are taken care of in Screenly. Whereas in Antheus, you yourself maintain the device. There is a semi-hosted version that you can do that we actually push out updates for you automatically using Balana. But the point is that you own the device yourself. You can do whatever you want to it. You can install it yourself, make modifications. It's all on you. So it's community supported. But that's really like what Antheus is geared towards, basic entry-level signage, really, where you don't really need to schedule content across multiple devices in multiple locations, for instance.
Yeah. And one interesting pathway we've seen, in particular, larger enterprise accounts, are people getting started who are in the IT team with Antheus, and then essentially, really pushing it to its limits before they decide to jump into the commercial side. So, another question on that, maybe give our viewers here some more information, is, what is a common pathway for enterprise users adopting Screenly, specifically on the Screenly Antheus open source edition to graduating to our commercial offering?
Yeah, I mean, so it really depends. So many large deal comes in from procurement team or security team or tech team from that company. They are the buyers, but we have seen companies coming in from Antheus who maybe in a scenario somebody has deployed Antheus on one or two devices in their office or at the campus or wherever it may be, and then as they start to scale up and they need more and more devices, that's when they say, actually, we do need a commercial contract for this, and we actually want to migrate to a service that is maintained and managed by a third party so that they don't have to do it themselves. So that's a fairly common customer journey that we see. So we don't really see Antheus. Well, there is some competition between Antheus and Screenly, obviously, but we see them as, for us, it's more like we're giving back with Antheus, and we're giving customers a free option to a lot of other alternatives out there that are paid alternatives, right? So if you have basic signage needs, Antheus is a great choice for you.
Right. A couple screens and can get them up and running, no problem. So,
and it also has a full API. Like you can actually build things on top of Antheus, right? So we have seen people actually building things on top of Antheus. So you can do that too.
So that's a good segue, I think, to another topic I think we should talk about, which is the variety of digital signage hardware that is available for buyers. If you type in online digital signage player, digital signage media device, tons of options come up. It can be very overwhelming.
Yes.
Do they all do the same thing? What are the differences? They become very opaque.
Comes back to software compass almost there, right?
Yeah. So, Victor, you recently made a thought piece on LinkedIn, talking a little bit about some of these quite literal black box devices, often coming out of mass production factories that are of questionable quality, particularly around security. So, so a question, Victor, what are some of the pitfalls that consumers and companies have when going out and trying to find digital signage hardware for the first time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it's also a hard question for people who are not in the, I guess, tech and IT world, right? And the piece you're referring to is I bought a media center unit for my car, and when I started poking into it, it was basically an Android device running, and already by the time I received this end of life version of Android. So that means that by the time I received it, it had not received the security updates for 4 years. And I mean, obviously it still works, but that's a massive security problem. And I made some parallels to the signage world, and you see, I mean, I get bombarded every week with vendors out of China selling these like Android signage players, right? And when you start looking closer, what you notice is that a lot of these devices are running very outdated versions of Android in particular, because a lot of these devices are actually running Android. The same argument can be held about, I don't know, running Windows XP on these devices, but the concept of end of life, I think, is very important, because for people not familiar with the concept, end of life basically means that the software vendor of the operating system, that's when they will stop shipping security updates. So there was a big thing, I guess, which has a bigger impact for the rest of the world, which is Windows 10, which was very popular, has now become end of life. That means that Microsoft will not provide any security updates to it whatsoever anymore. And the same holds true for Android. Every operating system, whatever type and flavor of operating system you're running, be a phone, be a tablet, or a digital signage player, they all have an end of life. And in some scenarios, you can upgrade the operating system. Usually not the case for, say, an Android tablet that you can do. And the concerning thing is that, particularly for signage, is that when you deploy these in the wild, these are, say, kiosks, for instance. They might handle personal data. People might use and type in information. When they stop receiving security updates, which they will when they reach end of life, they're essentially become a ticking time bomb. And you can essentially, if they're exposed to the internet, assure that eventually they will be compromised. If that's minor or major, depends, right? But the point is that it's very important when you're procuring signage to ask your vendor, what is the end of life for this device? And very few signage vendors would be operating system vendors, right? And none of them really are. If you're strict about it, none of them really are, because nobody writes their own operating system. They do package somebody else's operating system, be Linux or Windows or whatever it may be. But they all have an operating system, and that end of life needs to be communicated to customers, because that's it, right? That's when you stop receiving updates. You can push software updates, it's all fine, but you will not receive any software security updates past that point.
Yeah, and so on this topic of digital signage security and consumer choices, how much do you think the consumer can have some assurances from say government intervention? I mean, I know like recently the EU Cyber Resilience Act. How much can consumers rely on things like that as a safeguard versus how much should they just be consider themselves on their own and out in the Wild West, and every man for themselves? Where should they find the balance there?
I think it's very promising that we start to see government regulation talking about this. So California was actually one of the first ones doing this, and it usually comes from IoT, right? And starting to restrict the use of things like default passwords, and all these things are applicable to signage as well, right? Because I mean, what is a signage player? It's essentially it's a glorified IoT device with a screen at the end of the day, right? So these regulations are highly relevant for the signage industry, and quite honestly, I don't see this changing outside of the government essentially in whatever jurisdiction you're operating in is going to say, if you do not do this, then you will be fined, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think this is not a problem for really big savvy buyers, because they know what questions to ask. It's more lower to the mid segment of the market that's affected by this, and that's where I think they don't have perhaps the know-how to ask the right questions, and they perhaps just buying the cheapest player and the cheapest provider. And I know for a fact that a lot of our competitors, their security is, I mean, stuff of nightmares, right? Where you can have there are so many security vulnerabilities in these softwares that it's no way. There's no way, even if they have passed some compliance, BY, ISO, or SOC 2, it doesn't matter, because these compliance frameworks do not cover these things at all. So,
yeah, and security, I mean, it's a business cost at the end of the day, and it doesn't come for free. You need the in-house expertise. You need to actually have it executed. You need to have the safeguards and protocols to check things. And I think that's something a lot of digital signage consumers overlook, and they don't totally see the dynamic as to why the security features that are certainly good for them should not be assumed as a default.
I mean, at the end of the day, it always comes down to cost, right? Because somebody needs to foot the bill for this, right? And there's a good reason for why buying a cheap tablet with an end of life, or a cheap signage player that's end of life from China, and slap your own software to it is going to be cheaper than somebody who actually takes care of this properly. So that's kind of where legislation comes into play and kind of forces the market towards paying attention to these things.
Yeah, and I think that serves as a good transfer to the last point I want to cover here, which is at Screenly, really since day one, the company has been security focused, and security has been a priority. On that note, that's never a job that's done. It's
Correct.
just a job that has new tasks that continue forever.
Yes.
So on that, though, Screenly has made a recent push on some security topics. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so like you said, secure has been in our DNA from very early days, really. And we obviously follow the developments in the tech world and the security world. And one of the things that we are currently exploring now and working with is something called SBOMs, which stands for Software Bill of Material. And it's something coming out of an executive order in the US, where the US government essentially trying to enforce better what's called software supply chain security. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying before about end of life and all those things. It's basically an artifact of your software that states what part makes up for your software. And in today's world, almost every vendor would use open source software in some capacity or another, or libraries of some sort or another. These dependencies will get out of date, just like an operating system. They need to be maintained. They will have vulnerabilities, and they have different licenses. So depending on who your buyer is, you might have strict requirements for instance, you might not allow a supplier to use something like GPL3 because of compliance reasons. So SBOMs is kind of a push towards bringing greater transparency into software supply chain, and it can be both used for security arguments, but also for license compliance arguments. So that's something that we are right now exploring, and that's really still very early days on SBOMs. It's still very much shaping it up, and but it's something that we, like, again, going back to what we were talking about before, like being on the forefront of security, is something that we are paying attention to, and we're actually building out right now. And we've actually already started to see requests coming from our customers have started to ask about SBOMs, more like the very savvy customers.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's the typical story, right? Once there starts being some regulation around it, that's when people get the kick in their backside and start caring about it. So
absolutely, and I NIST 2.0, which was the security framework, doesn't explicitly state this. It was announced, I think, about a month ago. The new version. It doesn't explicitly state SBOMs. It's a hard requirement for compliance. But if I were to guess, the next version of NIST-like frameworks will start mandating this. And you mentioned some frameworks that are also kind of hinting at this, like the ones coming from the EU and the UK. There are some legislation that's hinting at this as well.
Yeah, I can definitely see signs of it coming around the corner. So, and last question, just zooming out a little bit. Still on the topic of digital signage security. I think there's kind of a misunderstanding too on what it means to have digital signage security compromised. Like, I think the immediate thing that comes to mind for people is, okay, it's going to show an image that you don't want to show, and that could be some, explicit material that's just otherwise embarrassing for the business and, bad for brand reputation and is, funny to the hacker, right?
For the lulz.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's a teenager who's, getting into hacking, and they thought it would be hilarious to take over the digital sign at their local mall, and maybe it is a little bit hilarious. Not for real, but anyways, we'll cut that out. Anyways, so question. So beyond showing something that the company doesn't want to show on digital sign, what are the other types of risk that a company faces when digital signage security is compromised? What should they be concerned about? Is there anything more than just what's displayed on the screen that they should care about?
Absolutely. I think that's the whole, like, defamation things. Yeah, it's a PR disaster, but it's not really. It can be dealt with, right? Where it gets a lot more dangerous is when signage devices are used as a stepping stone towards something greater. And there already is I mean, if you look at our security page, there are actually screen.io/security, there are actually some reference in there to where actually signage has been used as a stepping stone to a larger cybersecurity attack on a company. So I think that's a far more concerning risk that I guess is less obvious, but far more severe. And there've been, like I said, there have been examples of this already, where an attacker might use this device, and maybe it's for something as simple as, now it can use as a botnet and send data out from this, and like, okay, that's bad, but it's not as bad. But then you have the more severe things of like, we could use this to either learn more about the network infrastructure at the company, so we can then use it as like an intel device and like do recon through this device, and then leverage this as a stepping stone into a network. And that's where I think it gets far more interesting, right? Where you can actually, if you get a foothold in this device, you could then laterally, as it's called, move on to, say, a database server or an internal server that has a lot more data, and then that's where you get to the meat that you really are going after, right? That's, I think, those sort of things. And that, again, going back to the whole end of life, it might be a vulnerability in the operating system. It doesn't need to be a vulnerability in the signage software. It could be, say, a Bluetooth bug in an Android version that can be exploited remotely, what's called an RCE, remote code execution. So there are so many of the attack vectors that are exposed, right? It could be somebody plugging a USB stick. It could be something, anything in between.
I mean, and on that too, like a lot of digital signs, I mean, they are out in the wild, and they are not observed. They're not necessarily inside the business retail store. They can be even right outside using their local network, or just out in
the lobby, in a waiting room in a lobby,
right? A public lobby and outdoor shopping promenade. Like, there's a ton of examples.
I would hope they are better secured, but I think, like, definitely within a lobby where you actually have traffic footfall, that's far more realistic, right?
Yeah, but there are a lot of public, semi-public areas where they are not supervised, and someone with bad intentions can get physical access to begin with to one of these devices,
or even Bluetooth, right? Imagine you have a Bluetooth-enabled signage player,
right?
That can span walls, right? It might be inside the office, which is locked and gated, but you can stand outside that wall. Imagine it's a shared office. Like, you could potentially penetrate that device through a wall and then use that as a foothold into the network, right? So that's, there are plenty of attack vectors here. And I think that's something that, going back to where we started, I'm happy to see, for the first time in 12 some years we've been doing signage, to actually see people speaking about security. We've been beating this drum for over a decade now. And just in the last 6 months, we're starting to see people speaking about security in the signage industry. So I very much welcome that. Even if it's still early days and very rudimentary conversations, I'm still very happy to see that shift in industry happening.
Right. Well, what's the phrase? A ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So often like people care about security too late, and the prevention is, thinking about it before it's a problem is the way to go. So
exactly.
Cool. So that covers everything on my end, Victor. Coming up on 40 minutes here, so I think we've used our stage time, and
believe so.
This has been a fun episode of the Changelog, and to those listening, we'll be doing this every month as just
every
an industry
2 weeks.
update, and even sooner industry update and company update as well, just keeping everyone in the loop and apprised of what's going on. So it's been fun hanging out, and looking forward to talking to everyone next time. So
see you soon. Have a good one.
All right.
Thank you so much.
See ya.
Cheers.
Bye.